Early morning, June 6, 1944. Observation bunker. Pointe du Hoc, Normandy, France. Oberleutnant Frido Ebling stood at the western edge of the concrete fortification, binoculars pressed against his eyes as he surveyed the sheer limestone cliffs, plunging 100 feet to the narrow beach below. The English Channel stretched before him, grey and restless, waves breaking against the rocks with methodical violence. Behind him, soldiers from the 2nd Battery of Army Coastal Artillery Battalion, 1260, prepared for a day they had been told would come eventually, though perhaps not today, perhaps not ever in the way the High Command feared. Ebling lowered his binoculars. The cliffs fell away beneath his position at an angle that approached true vertical in several places. Limestone and chalk, ancient sedimentary rock compressed over millions of years, now serving as Germany's natural fortress. He had stood here dozens of times since his posting in 1943, and each time the same thought occurred to him: no force on earth could scale these cliffs under fire. It was not arrogance, it was mathematics, it was physics, it was the simple, undeniable reality of vertical assault against a defended position. The belief in Pointe du Hoc's impregnability was not unique to Ebling. It permeated the entire German defensive structure from the youngest grenadier to Field Marshal Erwin Rommel himself. This was not wishful thinking or propaganda-induced delusion. It was a conclusion drawn from careful tactical analysis, from the study of military history, from the fundamental principles of defensive warfare that had been refined over centuries. A man climbing a rope cannot effectively return fire. A man climbing a rope cannot take cover. A man climbing a rope is, for all practical purposes, helpless, and helpless men, the Germans knew, died quickly under concentrated fire. Yet within hours, that certainty would be tested in a way that would expose the single greatest vulnerability in the German defensive mindset: the inability to conceive that their enemy might be willing to attempt the genuinely impossible. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The story of Pointe du Hoc is not simply a story of brave men climbing a cliff. It is a story about the collision between tactical certainty and human determination, between what military theory declared impossible and what trained soldiers proved achievable. It is a story about the profound miscalculation that occurs when defenders assume their enemies will behave rationally, will follow the established rules of warfare, will recognize the futility of certain courses of action and therefore not attempt them. The Germans at Pointe du Hoc made a fatal error. They believed their own analysis. They believed the cliffs were unclimbable under fire because every calculation said they were, and in believing this, they prepared for every threat except the one that actually came. To understand how this happened, we must first understand the position itself, the fortress the Germans had constructed, and the absolute confidence they had in its defensive value. The promontory known as Pointe du Hoc jutted into the English Channel between the beaches that Allied planners would designate Utah and Omaha. From the clifftop, visibility extended more than 12 miles in clear weather. Any invasion fleet approaching these beaches would be visible long before it reached shore. And from this commanding height, artillery could rain destruction upon landing craft, upon troops wading through surf, upon the narrow strips of sand where men would be most vulnerable. The tactical value was obvious to both sides. What differed was their assessment of how that value could be neutralized. When Wehrmacht engineers first surveyed Pointe du Hoc in June of 1940, following the defeat of France, they recognized immediately that they had found something extraordinary. The cliffs provided a natural defensive barrier, superior to anything human engineering could construct. The beach at the base was narrow, perhaps 30 yards at low tide, littered with rocks and debris. The cliff face itself rose at angles between 75 and 90 degrees. In several locations, the rock actually overhung the beach below, creating sections where climbers would have to negotiate not just vertical ascent, but outward-leaning angles that would test even experienced mountaineers under ideal conditions. Over the following 4 years, the Germans transformed Pointe du Hoc from a natural strong point into a fortress complex that seemed to validate every assumption about its tactical impregnability. 6 captured French 155mm GPF howitzers were emplaced by late 1942. These were formidable weapons, each capable of firing a 95-pound shell to a range of approximately 20,000 yards. The guns were positioned in a configuration that provided overlapping fields of fire covering both Utah and Omaha beaches. 4 guns sat in open concrete emplacements, while 2 were being enclosed in massive H6-71 casemates, reinforced concrete structures designed to withstand direct hits from naval gunfire and aerial bombardment. The construction of these casemates alone demonstrated German confidence in holding this position indefinitely. The concrete walls were over 6 feet thick in places. Steel reinforcing rods ran through the concrete in complex patterns designed to absorb and distribute the shock of impact. The casemates were designed not just to protect the guns, but to allow them to continue firing even under sustained bombardment. This was not a temporary defensive position. This was intended to be permanent, an immovable anchor in the Atlantic wall that would still be operational years into the future. By spring of 1944, Pointe du Hoc had evolved into a complex that included far more than just artillery. An H6-36 observation bunker provided panoramic views of the invasion beaches. Anti-aircraft positions mounting 20mm and 37mm guns defended against air attack. Interconnecting trenches and tunnels allowed defenders to move between positions without exposing themselves to fire. Ammunition bunkers were built directly into the cliff face itself, carved into the limestone like ancient catacombs. Minefields covered every conceivable approach from inland. Wire obstacles created additional barriers. Machine gun positions were carefully sited to provide interlocking fields of fire. The garrison reflected the importance the Germans placed on this position. Approximately 125 infantry from the 726th Grenadier Regiment of the 716th Infantry Division provided the main defensive force. 85 artillerymen from the 2nd Battery of Army Coastal Artillery Battalion, 1260, manned the guns and maintained the equipment. Additional support came from elements of the 352nd Infantry Division positioned in reserve just behind Pointe du Hoc. These were not elite troops by German standards of 1944, but they were adequately trained, reasonably experienced, and defending a position that required more determination than skill. The soldiers who defended Pointe du Hoc understood the tactical mathematics of their situation, and those calculations gave them confidence that bordered on certainty. Letters home from the period reveal this mindset with remarkable clarity. Unteroffizier assigned to defend the eastern approach wrote to his wife on May 28, 1944, "We have the best position on the entire Atlantic wall. Let the Americans come if they dare. They will find nothing but death on our cliffs. Every man here knows these rocks are our fortress, and no enemy can climb them under our fire." This was not bravado. It was the conclusion of men who had studied their defensive position and understood its advantages. German defensive doctrine emphasized the principle of economy of force. A small number of defenders in a strong position could defeat a much larger attacking force. Pointe du Hoc seemed to be the perfect embodiment of this principle. The cliffs created a natural obstacle that negated numerical superiority. The defenders at the top had every advantage. The attackers below would have none. Field Marshal Rommel, appointed Inspector General of Atlantic Wall Defences in late 1943, personally inspected Pointe du Hoc on March 11, 1944. His diary, discovered in German military archives in 1973, recorded his assessment with the precision characteristic of his military thinking. The cliffs provide natural defence superior to any fortification we could construct. Enemy assault from the sea is tactically impossible. Our concern must be defence against airborne or inland attack. Rommel's assessment reveals the fundamental German assumption. The threat to Pointe du Hoc would come from paratroops landing behind the position or from infantry attacking from inland, not from the sea. The cliffs themselves provided such complete protection from seaward assault that German defensive planning focused almost entirely on other approaches. This was not stupidity or negligence. It was rational military planning based on accepted tactical principles, and it was exactly the kind of rational planning that would prove inadequate when confronted with an enemy willing to attempt the irrational. The mathematical certainty of German defensive victory at Pointe du Hoc was grounded in calculations that seemed unassailable. Allied forces, attempting to scale the cliffs, would be exposed to defensive fire for a minimum of 15 minutes, more likely 30, possibly more if ropes failed or men slipped during the climb. During that time, defenders at the cliff edge could fire directly down upon climbers who had no cover, no ability to maneuver, and severely limited capacity to return effective fire. A man on a rope, even a rope climbing expert under ideal conditions, has perhaps one hand free. Under fire, carrying equipment, with wet ropes and slippery handholds, the task approaches impossibility. German defensive plans called for machine gun positions spaced every 75 meters along the cliff edge, ensuring overlapping fields of fire that left no dead ground. The standard German machine gun of 1944, the MG-42, was capable of firing 1,200 rounds per minute. Even brief bursts from such weapons would be devastating against exposed climbers. Additionally, stick grenades could simply be dropped over the edge. The grenades would detonate among the climbers, with lethal effect. Even rocks pushed from the top would become deadly projectiles when dropped from 100 feet. German staff officers had calculated that a single defender at the cliff edge could kill or wound 10 attackers during such an assault. This was not speculation, but a calculation based on rate of fire, exposure time, and target vulnerability. With 200 defenders, the theoretical casualties that could be inflicted exceeded 2,000 before the position was overrun, and this assumed perfect execution by the attackers, no equipment failures, ideal weather, and sustained aggressive assault in the face of devastating casualties. Under realistic conditions, the Germans believed, any attempt to scale Pointe du Hoc from the sea would result in complete destruction of the attacking force before significant numbers reached the top. This analysis was not wrong in its fundamentals. The Germans had correctly identified the tactical advantages of the defensive position. What they failed to account for was the possibility that their enemy might have developed specialized techniques, equipment, and training specifically designed to overcome these advantages. They failed to imagine that the Americans might have created a force that trained for this exact mission for months. They failed to conceive that military planners might commit such forces to what appeared to be a near-suicidal mission because the strategic necessity demanded it. Across the English Channel, in the heavily guarded planning rooms of Allied Supreme Headquarters in London, a very different set of calculations was being made. General Dwight D. Eisenhower and his staff had identified Pointe du Hoc as one of the most dangerous German defensive positions on the Normandy coast. Those 6 155mm guns, if they remained operational on D-Day, could devastate both Utah and Omaha beaches during the critical hours when troops would be most vulnerable. A single battery firing with accuracy could sink or damage dozens of landing craft, could destroy tanks before they left the water, could turn the narrow beaches into killing grounds where the invasion might stall or even fail completely. Allied intelligence had studied Pointe du Hoc intensively. Reconnaissance aircraft had photographed the position repeatedly. The photographs showed the gun emplacements, the observation bunker, the defensive positions, the trenches, the access roads. What the photographs could not show was the determination of the defenders or the difficulty of the tactical problem. But Allied planners did not need photographs to understand the challenge. They understood that Pointe du Hoc represented one of the most difficult tactical problems of the entire invasion. General Omar Bradley, commanding 1st United States Army and responsible for the American sector of the invasion, faced a decision that would trouble him for years afterward. The guns at Pointe du Hoc had to be neutralized before the main landings began. This was not optional. This was an absolute necessity. Naval gunfire and aerial bombardment might damage the position, but the massive concrete casemates were specifically designed to survive such attacks. Paratroopers could be dropped inland to attack from behind, but the close terrain of Norman hedgerows made that approach uncertain. The results might not be achieved in time, and coordination between airborne and amphibious forces was notoriously difficult. Only one option offered certainty of success, and it seemed to violate every principle of military tactics. A specialized force would have to land at the base of the cliffs, scale them under fire, fight their way to the gun positions, and destroy the artillery in close combat. When Bradley presented this mission concept to his staff, the response was skeptical. Naval planners declared it could not be done. One officer reportedly stated that 3 old women with brooms could keep any force from climbing those cliffs. But Bradley was not looking for conventional solutions. He was looking for a force that could execute the unconventional, that specialized in difficult missions, that trained for exactly the kind of operation that conventional wisdom declared impossible. He found that force in the Rangers. The United States Army Rangers of 1944 traced their lineage to Rogers Rangers of the French and Indian War, but their immediate origins lay in the British commando concept. In 1942, recognizing the need for specialized units capable of raids and difficult assaults, the Army had created Ranger Battalions modeled on British commando organization and training. These units were smaller than standard infantry battalions, more heavily armed, and subjected to training regimens that emphasized physical conditioning, small unit tactics, amphibious operations, and the execution of missions considered too difficult or too risky for conventional forces. The 2nd Ranger Battalion, activated in April of 1943, consisted of 545 men organized into 6 companies. Command fell to Lieutenant Colonel James Earl Rudder, a 34-year-old reserve officer from Brady, Texas. Rudder had been a high school teacher and football coach before the war, not a professional soldier, but he possessed qualities that made him ideal for the mission ahead: calm determination, attention to detail, and the ability to inspire confidence in men about to attempt something genuinely dangerous. When Bradley explained the Pointe du Hoc mission to Rudder on February 3, 1944, the general's discomfort was evident. This mission pushed the boundaries of what could reasonably be asked of soldiers. Bradley looked across the map table at the younger officer and spoke honestly about what both men understood. This could be the most dangerous mission of the entire invasion. Rudder studied the reconnaissance photographs. Aerial images showed the stark vertical walls rising from the narrow beach. He noted the gun emplacements, the observation bunker, the defensive positions along the cliff edge. The tactical problem was obvious. The solution was less so. Then Rudder looked up at Bradley and spoke words that would echo through the mission, planning and execution. "My men can do it, sir." Whether Rudder truly believed this at that moment or whether he understood that the mission had to be attempted regardless of the odds is uncertain. What is certain is that from that meeting forward, the 2nd Ranger Battalion began preparing for a mission unlike any other in the invasion plan. The preparation would be meticulous, the training would be exhaustive, and the execution would test the limits of human courage and tactical possibility. The planning for Operation Overlord called for Pointe du Hoc to be assaulted by Force A, consisting of Companies D, E, and F of the 2nd Ranger Battalion, a total of 225 men. They would be supported by the 5th Ranger Battalion under Lieutenant Colonel Max Schneider, designated Force C, which would follow if the assault succeeded or divert to Omaha Beach if it failed. The landing was scheduled for H-hour at 6:30 a.m. on D-Day, with naval gunfire support from the battleship USS Texas and destroyers USS Satterlee and HMS Talibont. But the challenge that dominated all planning discussions was fundamental and seemingly insurmountable. How do you climb 100 feet of sheer cliff while men above you are actively trying to kill you? The answer would require innovation, specialized equipment, intensive training, and a level of determination that could not be taught but had to be built into the unit's culture and identity. The Rangers began that process in April of 1944 on the cliffs near Swanage on the southern coast of England. The cliffs at Swanage bore some resemblance to those at Pointe du Hoc, though they were neither as high nor as sheer. But they were sufficient for training purposes, and they offered something equally valuable: the expertise of British commandos who had conducted coastal raids against German positions in Norway and France. These veterans had learned through hard experience what worked and what didn't when assaulting defended cliffs, and they shared that knowledge with a frankness born of respect for the task ahead. Captain David Niven of the British Commandos, a film actor in civilian life who had returned to military service at the outbreak of war, addressed a group of Rangers during an early training session. His words were blunt, Climbing under fire is not like mountain climbing. Your enemy is not the rock, but the man at the top trying to kill you. Speed is your only defense, and even speed may not be enough. The Rangers began testing every conceivable method of cliff assault. Traditional mountaineering techniques were too slow. Rope ladders were considered but rejected as too vulnerable to being cut or dislodged. What emerged as the most promising approach was a system of rocket-propelled grappling hooks. A small rocket motor attached to a grapnel and rope could be fired from a launcher, sending the grappling hook over the cliff edge, where it would catch on rocks or obstacles. Multiple ropes would create a network of climbing lines, providing redundancy if some were cut or failed. The rocket grapnels were not perfect. They were temperamental, sometimes failing to fire, sometimes firing prematurely. The rockets produced considerable smoke and flame, revealing their launch positions to defenders, and the grapnels themselves were heavy, awkward devices that required careful handling, but they solved the fundamental problem of getting ropes to the clifftop quickly, faster than men could throw them, and from positions that offered at least some cover at the cliff base. Through April and May of 1944, the Rangers practiced on the Swanage Cliffs repeatedly. First Sergeant Leonard Lamell, a 24-year-old from Point Pleasant Beach, New Jersey, commanded D Company's 2nd Platoon. His letters home documented the evolution of their technique. On April 23rd, he wrote, "We have climbed these cliffs so many times I dream about them. Today we tried wet ropes because ours will be soaked with seawater. They are slippery as ice, and 2 men fell, though neither was seriously hurt. Tomorrow we practice with full combat loads, 60 pounds of weapons and ammunition." The training revealed problems that had to be solved. Wet ropes were indeed slippery, far more difficult to climb than dry ones. The solution was specialized gloves with leather palms and fingers, providing better grip. Full combat loads made climbing exhausting, so the Rangers developed a technique of team climbing. One man would go up fast and light, carrying only a pistol or carbine, establishing a position at the top to provide covering fire. Others would follow with heavier weapons. The strongest climbers carried Browning automatic rifles, 19-pound weapons that could deliver sustained automatic fire. Each company was issued thermite grenades, special incendiary devices that burned at over 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to melt gun mechanisms and weld steel components together. These would be critical for destroying the artillery pieces, which were far too large to be damaged by conventional explosives carried by infantry. The thermite grenades weighed 2 pounds each and were delicate, requiring careful handling, but they represented the only practical means of rendering the German guns permanently inoperable. The training was not without casualties. Men fell during practice climbs, though fortunately none were killed. Equipment failed, ropes parted under load, grapnels pulled free. Each failure was analyzed, solutions were developed, and the training continued. By late May, the Rangers had developed a level of proficiency that impressed even the skeptical British commandos. They could land on a beach, deploy their rocket grapnels, and have men at the clifftop in under 5 minutes under ideal conditions. Under combat conditions, with enemy fire and equipment failures, it would take longer. But they had proven it could be done. Colonel Rudder addressed his battalion in the final briefing on June 4, 1944, as the Rangers assembled for the journey across the Channel. His words were honest about the danger they faced. "Gentlemen, I will not lie to you about what we face. The Germans will have every advantage. They will be above us, behind cover, with clear fields of fire. We will be exposed on ropes, carrying heavy loads, with no place to hide. Some of us will not reach the top. Some of us will not survive the day." He paused, letting that reality settle. Then he continued, "But I know this with absolute certainty. If any fighting force on earth can take Pointe du Hoc, it is this battalion. We have trained for this mission for 3 months. We know the ground, we know our weapons, and we know each other. When we land on that beach, we will climb those cliffs faster than the Germans believe possible. We will reach the top before they can kill us all. And when we reach the top, we will complete our mission. Those guns will be destroyed. The invasion will succeed. Are you with me?" The response from 225 throats was instantaneous and would become the Ranger motto, Rangers lead the way, sir. The crossing of the English Channel began at 4:45 a.m. on June 6, 1944. Rangers boarded their landing craft assault vessels from the troop transport HMS Amsterdam in darkness and rough seas. Each LCA carried 22 men. 9 LCAs in total carried the assault force, with 2 additional craft carrying supplies, and 4 DUKW amphibious trucks mounting 100-foot extension ladders borrowed from the London Fire Brigade. These ladders represented a backup plan. If the rocket grapnels failed completely, the ladders could be extended against the cliff face, though this would require the DUKWs to navigate the beach obstacles and craters. The seas were far rougher than any training exercise. Waves reached 5 to 6 feet, and the heavily loaded LCAs pitched and rolled violently. Many Rangers became violently seasick in the crowded, heaving landing craft. Private First Class Harry Fate, a rifleman in E Company, later described the journey. "We were soaked before we were 10 minutes from the ship. Sea spray washed over the low sides of the LCA continuously. Men vomited. Others bailed water desperately to keep us from swamping. Around us in the darkness were thousands of ships, the greatest armada in history. We were part of something immense. But in that moment, cold and wet and sick, it felt very small and personal." At 5:50 a.m., as first light touched the eastern sky, the naval bombardment of Pointe du Hoc began. USS Texas, a battleship mounting 10 14-inch guns, opened fire from a position 10,000 yards offshore. The massive shells, each weighing 1,400 pounds, screamed overhead and impacted the clifftop with earth-shaking explosions. In exactly 34 minutes, USS Texas fired 255 14-inch shells at Pointe du Hoc, averaging over 7 shells per minute. The destroyers, Satterlee and Talibont, added their 5-inch guns to the barrage. The Rangers, struggling through rough seas in their landing craft, could see the clifftop erupting in fountains of earth and concrete debris. Fires burned. Smoke obscured sections of the cliff. The bombardment was the heaviest concentration of naval gunfire directed at any single target on D-Day, and it transformed the landscape of Pointe du Hoc into a moonscape of overlapping craters. For the Rangers watching from their pitching boats, the bombardment offered reassurance. Surely nothing could survive such punishment. But even as the naval guns pounded Pointe du Hoc, the first critical mistake of the assault was unfolding. In the darkness and confusion, Lieutenant Colin Beaver of the Royal Navy Volunteer Reserve, commanding the lead motor launch, guiding the assault force, had navigated incorrectly. Instead of heading directly toward Pointe du Hoc, the flotilla was travelling parallel to the coast toward Pointe de la Percée, 3 miles to the east. First Sergeant Lommel was among the first to notice the error. Looking through the spray at the cliffs ahead, he saw the wrong configuration of rock formations. The coastline didn't match the photographs and maps he had studied for months. He scrambled across the crowded LCA to the British coxswain. "That's not the point. We're off course." The realization spread through the assault force. Officers checked maps against the visible coastline. The error became undeniable. Lieutenant Beaver acknowledged the mistake and ordered a course correction, but precious time had been lost. The assault, scheduled for H-hour at 6:30 a.m., would not reach the beach until after 7 o'clock. The 40-minute delay meant the Rangers would climb in full daylight rather than the relative concealment of dawn. Worse, 40 minutes after the naval bombardment ended, German defenders would have time to recover and man their positions. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The navigation error had another consequence that would profoundly affect the assault. Company C of the 2nd Rangers, which had been assigned to assault Pointe de la Percée to the east, landed correctly at their objective at approximately 6:40 a.m. Captain Ralph Goranson led 70 men up those cliffs and seized their objective with relatively light casualties. But they were now separated from the main assault by 3 miles of enemy-held coast. They could provide no support to the force attacking Pointe du Hoc. Meanwhile, the remaining 4 companies of the 2nd Rangers and the entire 5th Ranger Battalion, waiting offshore for the signal that Pointe du Hoc had been taken, never received that signal. The plan had called for a radio transmission by 6:30 a.m. if the assault was succeeding. The transmission would bring the 5th Rangers and additional 2nd Ranger companies to Pointe du Hoc to exploit success, but the 40-minute delay meant no such transmission was sent. Following his orders, Lieutenant Colonel Schneider made the difficult decision to divert to Omaha Beach. His 500 men would land at WWII sector, where they would fight a different battle. Their actions there may have been decisive in the eventual breakthrough at that bloodiest of landing beaches, but it meant the 225 men of Force A would assault Pointe du Hoc alone, with no prospect of immediate reinforcement. At 7:10 a.m., the landing craft carrying Force A finally turned toward the correct objective. The cliffs of Pointe du Hoc rose before them, stark and vertical in the morning light. Their faces were pockmarked and cratered from the massive bombardment. Smoke still drifted from shattered bunkers at the top. The narrow strip of beach at the cliff base, perhaps 30 yards wide at low tide, was littered with rocks and bomb craters. Above it, the cliff face rose straight up, 100 feet of limestone and chalk. The 1st LCA, number 888, carrying Colonel Rudder and elements of E Company, ground onto the beach at 7:13 a.m. The ramp splashed down into knee-deep water. Rudder was the first man off, running toward the cliff base through a hail of machine gun fire that erupted from positions along the cliff edge. The Germans had recovered from the bombardment faster than anyone had hoped. They were alive, they were alert, and they were ready. Lieutenant James Eichner, last off LCA 888, would recall the moment with perfect clarity decades later. I ran down the ramp into water, about up to my knees, and headed across what beach there was to the cliff wall, which seemed like a mile away but probably was no more than 50 to 70 yards. The Germans were firing down at us, machine guns mostly, but also rifles. I could hear rounds snapping past my head. Men were hit before they reached the cliff. The only thought in my mind was, to get to the base of that cliff, because at least there the Germans cannot shoot straight down at you. Across a 500-yard front, 9 landing craft disgorged their loads of Rangers. The rocket-equipped grappling hooks fired immediately, small puffs of smoke and flame as the rockets ignited, sending the grapnels arcing toward the clifftop. Some ropes, soaked with seawater during the long approach, were too heavy. The rockets lacked sufficient power, and the grapnels fell short. Others caught on the irregular cliff edge, and Rangers immediately began climbing. The extension ladders on the DUKWs proved nearly useless. Bomb craters from the naval bombardment had turned the beach into a broken landscape of overlapping holes. The vehicles could not get close enough to the cliff base for the ladders to reach. One DUKW managed to extend its ladder partway up the cliff, and a few Rangers used it, but it provided only marginal assistance. The German response was immediate and would have been devastating if not for the speed of the Ranger assault. Machine gun fire raked the beach and the cliff face. MG-42 machine guns, capable of firing 1,200 rounds per minute, created curtains of bullets. Potato masher grenades came tumbling over the cliff edge, exploding among the climbing Rangers, and the Germans employed a simple but effective tactic. They pushed rocks over the edge. Limestone chunks weighing 5, 10, 20 pounds became deadly projectiles when dropped from 100 feet. Several Rangers were struck by falling rocks and knocked from their ropes. But the Rangers at the beach and in the landing craft provided suppressing fire that proved critical. Browning automatic rifles, Thompson submachine guns, and Monet-Garand rifles poured automatic weapons fire at any German who showed himself at the cliff edge. The volume of fire was intense enough that German defenders could not maintain effective aimed fire on the climbers without exposing themselves to almost certain death. Moreover, the destroyers Satterlee and Talibont had moved in dangerously close to shore, their captains risking their ships on underwater obstacles to provide direct fire support. Their 5-inch guns fired at any bunker or position that showed activity. The shells impacted along the clifftop with devastating effect. The tactical advantage began to shift. The Germans retained the high ground, but they could not exploit it effectively without accepting casualties they were unwilling to absorb. The Rangers, though exposed during their climb, were climbing faster than German defensive doctrine had calculated possible. They had trained for this exact scenario. They knew their equipment. They climbed with a speed born of desperation and skill combined. At 7:25 a.m., 15 minutes after landing, the first Rangers reached the top. Sergeant Haywood Robbie Robinson of E Company was among the first over the edge. He immediately encountered 3 German defenders preparing to drop grenades over the cliff. Robinson opened fire with his Thompson submachine gun at point-blank range, killing all 3. Other Germans, shocked by the speed of the assault, retreated from the cliff edge into the network of trenches and bunkers. Within 5 minutes, approximately 30 Rangers from D and E companies had established a toehold on the cliff top. The climb that German planners had calculated would take 30 minutes or more, resulting in catastrophic casualties, had been accomplished in under 20 minutes with casualties that, while significant, were not crippling. The Rangers had proven what military theory said was impossible. They had scaled a defended cliff under fire and established themselves at the top. But their jubilation at reaching the cliff top was short-lived. As they moved toward the massive gun emplacements, fighting through a landscape of craters and shattered concrete, they made a discovery that sent a shock through the assault force. The casemates were empty. The gun emplacements held only wooden telephone poles, crude decoys painted to resemble artillery pieces when viewed from the air or sea. The 6 155mm guns, the entire reason for this assault, the target that had justified the risk of 225 men, were gone. Lieutenant Eichner, having reached the top with a group from E Company, ran toward gun emplacement number 4. His first thought was one of stunned disbelief. Jesus Christ, there's no guns here. We just climbed a 100-foot cliff under fire, lost men on the way up, and the damn guns aren't even here. For a moment, I thought the whole mission had been for nothing. The discovery created a crisis of purpose. The Rangers had accomplished the impossible by reaching the cliff top, but they had not accomplished their mission. The guns remained a threat, wherever they were, and the Rangers were now isolated on a cliff top, surrounded by German forces, with casualties mounting and no immediate prospect of relief. Colonel Rudder, having reached the top and established his command post near the tip of the point, reorganized his forces with remarkable speed. The mission had changed, but it had not failed. The guns had been moved, but they could not be far. Artillery pieces that size, each weighing several tons, could not be transported quickly over Norman roads. They had to be nearby, probably positioned to fire, probably still representing the threat that had made this assault necessary. Rudder's orders were direct. Find those guns. They cannot be far. Destroy them wherever they are. By 7:45 a.m., Rangers from all 3 companies had reached the top, though at terrible cost. Of the 225 men who had landed, approximately 35 were already dead or wounded on the beach and cliff face. Another 15 had been hit after reaching the top. That left roughly 175 Rangers to accomplish a mission that had been designed for a full battalion, and now the mission had expanded beyond the original objective. Companies D and E moved off the point itself and established roadblocks along the coastal highway. This was part of their original mission, to cut the road and prevent German reinforcements from moving between Utah and Omaha beaches. The highway ran roughly parallel to the coast, about 200 meters south of Pointe du Hoc. Controlling this road was critical to isolating the Promise, invasion beaches from German counterattack. Staff Sergeant Len Lamel, despite minor wounds received during the climb, led his platoon to a position astride the road. By 8:15 a.m., about 35, Rangers from D and E companies had established a defensive perimeter along the highway. The position was tenuous, exposed to fire from multiple directions, but it dominated the road itself. Lamel and Staff Sergeant Jack Kuhn, his closest friend and the acting platoon sergeant, noticed a dirt road leading inland from the coastal highway. The road showed heavy track marks, deep ruts as though something large and wheeled had passed recently. Both men had the same thought. The missing guns might have made those tracks. Artillery pieces moved on wheeled carriages. Those carriages would leave distinctive marks on soft ground. Without orders, operating on initiative and tactical instinct that exemplified Ranger training, they decided to investigate. At approximately 8:45 a.m., Lommel and Kuhn moved cautiously down the sunken lane, a typical Norman farm track enclosed by 9-foot-tall hedgerows. They moved using leapfrog technique, one man advancing while the other covered, weapons ready, expecting contact at any moment. After advancing about 250 yards south of the coastal highway, Lommel abruptly stopped. He had seen something through a gap in the hedgerow. He turned to Kuhn and half-whispered words that would become legendary in Ranger history. "Jack, here they are. We've found them. Here are the goddamned guns." There, in an orchard camouflaged with netting, sat 5 of the 6 missing 155mm howitzers. They were positioned in a battery formation, ready to fire. Their barrels pointed northwest toward Utah Beach. Piles of ammunition sat stacked nearby, ready for use. Incredibly, no Germans were visible in the immediate vicinity. About 100 meters away across an open field, Lommel could see approximately 100 German soldiers, apparently artillerymen and guards, gathered in what looked like a formation or briefing. They had no idea that 2 American soldiers were within grenade range of their artillery. Lommel assessed the situation instantly. He and Kuhn carried 1 thermite grenade each. 2 grenades were not enough to destroy 5 guns completely, but they could not wait. Every minute of delay increased the chance that these guns would open fire on the landing beaches, where thousands of American soldiers were at their most vulnerable. The artillery had to be disabled immediately. He turned to Kuhn. "Give me your grenade, Jack. Cover me. I'm going to fix them." While Kuhn crouched in position with his Thompson submachine gun ready, Lommel crawled to the first gun. He placed his thermite grenade in the gun's recoil mechanism, the complex hydraulic assembly that absorbed the shock of firing. He pulled the pin. The thermite ignited with minimal sound, no explosion, just intense heat. It burned at over 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit, a flowing river of molten metal that seeped into every crevice of the mechanism, welding gears together, fusing moving parts into a solid, useless mass. He placed Kuhn's grenade in the traversing mechanism of the second gun, the gearing that allowed the gun to rotate on its mount. He pulled that pin as well. Then, with both grenades expended but the job incomplete, he improvised. He pulled off his field jacket, wrapped it around the butt of his Thompson submachine gun to muffle the sound, and systematically smashed the optical sights on all 5 weapons. The sights were precision instruments, German-made telescopic devices that allowed accurate fire at ranges exceeding 10 miles. They were impossible to replace in the field. Without them, the guns could not be aimed with the accuracy necessary for effective fire against landing beaches. A gun firing without proper sights was not much more dangerous than not firing at all. Entire process took less than 10 minutes. Then Lommel and Kuhn withdrew as silently as they had come, moving back through the hedgerows toward their roadblock position. The German soldiers across the field never saw them. The greatest single threat to the D-Day landings had been neutralized by 2 sergeants operating on their own initiative, armed with 2 grenades and the courage to approach enemy artillery with enemy soldiers nearby. But Lommel knew the mission was not complete. 3 guns were damaged, 2 by thermite, 3 with destroyed sights, but they needed to be destroyed beyond any possibility of repair. The recoil mechanisms might be welded, but German engineers might be able to replace them. The traversing gear might be fused, but that could potentially be repaired. What was needed was complete, irreversible destruction. Lommel reached their roadblock position and immediately began collecting thermite grenades from other Rangers. Most men had not used theirs. The climb had been so fast, the initial fighting so brief, that grenades intended for destroying guns had not been needed. Within minutes, Lommel had a field jacket full of thermite grenades, perhaps a dozen in total. He and Kuhn immediately headed back toward the orchard. They reached the gun position around 9 o'clock a.m. Again, incredibly, no Germans were present at the guns themselves. The formation Lommel had seen earlier had apparently dispersed, perhaps moving to defensive positions as the reality of the invasion became clear. Kuhn took up his covering position while Lommel methodically placed thermite grenades on the 3 guns he had previously damaged, ensuring their complete destruction. Additional grenades went into ammunition stacks, igniting propellant charges and rendering shells useless. He pulled the pins and began to withdraw. Just as he climbed over the 9-foot hedgerow where Kuhn was waiting, the entire world exploded. A massive detonation threw both men off the hedgerow and into the sunken road. Debris, dirt, shell fragments, and equipment rained from the sky. For a moment, both men lay stunned, ears ringing, unsure if they had been hit or if the thermite had somehow caused a chain reaction. What neither man knew was that Sergeant Frank Rupinski, leading a patrol from E Company, had discovered a massive German ammunition dump approximately 100 yards from the gun position. Rupinski had destroyed it with grenades, and the resulting explosion was enormous. The entire German defensive position in that sector was compromised by the loss of that ammunition. At 9:05 a.m., Lommel sent a runner back to Colonel Rudder with a message that would determine the assessment of the entire Pointe du Hoc mission. Located guns, all destroyed. Mission accomplished. Rudder, whose command post was under increasing German fire, allowed himself a moment of satisfaction before the reality of their tactical situation reasserted itself. The guns were destroyed. The mission, technically, was accomplished. But now, 175 Rangers were isolated on a clifftop, surrounded by German forces of unknown strength, with dwindling ammunition and no prospect of immediate relief. They had accomplished their primary objective. Now they had to survive long enough for that accomplishment to matter. Throughout the afternoon of June 6th, German counterattacks increased in intensity. Elements of the 914th Grenadier Regiment probed the Ranger positions. Mortar fire pounded the roadblock positions along the coastal highway. Snipers took up positions in the hedgerows, firing at any Ranger who exposed himself. The observation bunker at the tip of Pointe du Hoc, a massive concrete structure that had survived the naval bombardment, still held German defenders. Rangers poured bazooka rounds and grenades through the firing slits, but the Germans inside refused to surrender. The tactical situation was deteriorating. The Rangers held two separate positions, the command post perimeter on Pointe du Hoc itself and the roadblock positions along the coastal highway 200 meters inland. Communication between these positions was intermittent. Runners had to cross open ground under fire. Radio communication was unreliable. Several radios had been damaged during the landing or the climb. By nightfall on June 6th, Colonel Rudder faced the most difficult command decision of his life. Of his original 225 men, more than 1/3 were dead or wounded, though many of the wounded were still fighting. Ammunition was running critically low, especially grenades and mortar rounds. Medical supplies were nearly exhausted, and the wounded lay in crude aid stations with minimal treatment. The Germans held the high ground on three sides, and were clearly preparing for a major counterattack. British Commando Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Trevor, who had come ashore with the Rangers as an observer, remarked with characteristic British understatement, "Never have I been so convinced of anything as that I will be either a prisoner of war or a casualty by morning." The night of June 6th to 7th was a desperate struggle for survival. German counterattacks came in waves. Flares lit the night sky, casting stark shadows across the cratered landscape. Machine gun tracers crisscrossed the darkness in deadly geometry. The Rangers, exhausted from the climb and the day's fighting, took turns on watch. Sleep was impossible for most. Every sound in the darkness might signal another attack. At approximately 11 p.m., a more serious counterattack developed. German infantry, estimated at company strength, advanced from the south toward the Ranger roadblock positions. The attack was preceded by mortar fire, shells dropping among the Ranger positions with methodical precision. Then came the assault itself. German infantry advancing in short rushes, using proper fire and movement tactics, clearly not green troops but experienced soldiers who understood their business. The Rangers met them with everything they had. Browning automatic rifles fired in short, controlled bursts to conserve ammunition. Monet-Garans cracked steadily. Grenades arced through the darkness. The Germans came within 50 meters of the Ranger positions before the attack stalled. The volume of American fire, even from depleted ammunition stocks, was sufficient to break the momentum of the assault. The Germans withdrew, leaving dead and wounded in the fields between the positions. The Rangers had held, but at cost. Another 6 men were dead, 10 more wounded. Ammunition stocks were now critical. The 60mm mortars were down to their last few rounds. First Sergeant Lamel, checking positions after the attack, found men with fewer than 10 rounds remaining for their rifles. Some Rangers had taken weapons and ammunition from dead Germans, and Monet-Garand being traded for a Mauser Car 98, American 30-06 ammunition supplemented with German 7.92mm rounds. June 7th brought renewed German pressure. Counterattacks developed from multiple directions, suggesting that the Germans were bringing up reinforcements. Intelligence later confirmed that elements of the 352nd Infantry Division, originally positioned as operational reserves, were being committed piecemeal against the Rangers. The tactical situation was becoming untenable. The roadblock force on the coastal highway, now numbering about 85 men, including 23 Rangers from the 5th Battalion, who had managed to reach them on the evening of June 6th by fighting their way west from Omaha Beach, was in danger of being cut off. The command post perimeter on Pointe du Hoc itself, defending against attacks from the west, was down to about 90 men, many of them wounded. Colonel Rudder himself had been wounded twice during the fighting, shrapnel wounds to his leg, an arm that he refused to allow the medics to treat beyond basic bandaging. Rudder faced a decision. Should he consolidate his forces into a single defensive position on Pointe du Hoc, or maintain the roadblock on the coastal highway despite the risk of being overrun? He chose to hold both positions, gambling that reinforcements would arrive before his isolated companies were destroyed. It was a decision that reflected both tactical necessity and the Ranger ethos. They had been given a mission to hold the coastal road. They would hold it until relieved or destroyed. The German attacks on June 7th were relentless. Machine gun positions that had been bypassed during the initial assault now opened fire from unexpected angles. Snipers were everywhere, firing from concealed positions in the rubble. The Rangers discovered that some German positions were connected by tunnels and trenches, allowing defenders to appear, fire, and disappear before the Rangers could respond effectively. By the evening of June 7th, the situation was desperate. Ammunition was nearly exhausted. The last 60mm mortar rounds had been fired that afternoon. Grenades were gone, expended in repelling counterattacks or used to destroy the guns. Some Rangers were down to their last clips for their Monet rifles. Water was running low, canteens had been drained, and there was no way to resupply. Medical supplies were exhausted completely, and the wounded lay in crude aid stations, little more than shell craters covered with canvas, receiving virtually no treatment beyond what could be improvised. The night of June 7th to 8th brought the crisis point. A coordinated German attack, estimated at battalion strength, struck the Ranger positions at midnight. This was no probing attack, no limited objective assault, but a deliberate, coordinated effort designed to annihilate the Rangers. Artillery preparation pounded the defensive positions for 15 minutes. The shells were small, caliber, probably from captured French 75mm guns, but they were accurately directed and devastatingly effective against the shallow Ranger positions. Then came the infantry, advancing in mass behind the barrage. The Rangers, firing carefully to conserve their last ammunition, waited until the Germans were within 50 meters before opening fire. The volume of fire was devastating despite the low ammunition stocks. Every round had to count, and the Rangers made them count. Germans fell, but others kept coming. This was a determined assault by soldiers who believed they could overwhelm the American position through sheer numbers and aggression. First Sergeant Lamel, commanding a section of the roadblock, found himself down to 3 rounds for his Thompson and 1 grenade. When German infantry appeared within 20 meters of his position, advancing through a gap in the hedgerow, he fired his last 3 rounds in a controlled burst. He threw his last grenade into the gap. The explosion was followed by screams. Then he picked up a Monet rifle from a dead Ranger beside him and continued fighting with that. The attack broke less than 10 meters from the Ranger positions. The Germans, having taken murderous casualties from the concentrated defensive fire, withdrew into the darkness. Behind them, they left dozens of dead and wounded. The Rangers, checking their ammunition after the attack, found they had collectively perhaps 100 rounds remaining for all weapons combined. If the Germans attacked again with similar strength, there would be no way to stop them. Dawn on June 8th brought an almost eerie quiet to Pointe du Hoc. German pressure had ceased, not because they had given up, but because they were regrouping for what they assumed would be a final assault. The Rangers had held for nearly 48 hours against overwhelming odds, but both sides understood that the situation could not continue much longer. The Rangers were out of ammunition, exhausted, and could not possibly repel another major attack. The Germans knew this, or at least suspected it, and were preparing to finish what they had started. The Rangers, almost out of ammunition and utterly exhausted, prepared for what they knew might be their last stand. Rudder organized his remaining effective men into a final defensive line. Wounded who could hold a weapon were given the few remaining rifles. Men armed themselves with rocks, with German weapons scavenged from the battlefield, with bayonets fixed to empty rifles. If the Germans came, the Rangers would fight until they were killed or overrun. There would be no surrender. That was understood by everyone. Then, around noon on June 8th, observers at Pointe du Hoc spotted movement to the east. A column of troops was approaching along the coastal highway. For a terrible moment, the Rangers thought it was another German attack, one they could not possibly repel. Every man capable of fighting moved to defensive positions. What few rounds remained were distributed. Rudder himself, wounded and exhausted, took position with a carbine, prepared to fight in the final defense. Then someone spotted American helmets. The distinctive Monet helmet, different in silhouette from the German coal scuttle design. Rangers from the 5th Battalion, accompanied by elements of the 116th Infantry Regiment from the 29th Division and tanks from the 743rd Tank Battalion, were advancing from Omaha Beach. The column had fought its way west along the coastal highway, clearing German positions, taking casualties but maintaining momentum. They had been ordered to relieve Pointe du Hoc, and they had accomplished that mission. The siege was over. The relief force that reached Pointe du Hoc found a scene that shocked even veteran soldiers who had fought through the carnage of Omaha Beach. The landscape was cratered beyond recognition, overlapping shell holes and bomb craters creating a lunar terrain. The Rangers who emerged from their positions were unrecognizable, covered in mud and blood and cordite smoke. Uniforms were torn and filthy. Many men were wounded but still on their feet, refusing to be evacuated until others more seriously hurt had been treated. All were exhausted, faces hollow-eyed from lack of sleep, hands shaking from adrenaline depletion. When the reinforcements counted the survivors, the cost of the mission became devastatingly clear. Of the 225 Rangers who had landed on June 6th, only 90 were still able to fight. 65 were dead, 70 were wounded, some so severely they would never return to combat. The casualty rate exceeded 60%, among the highest of any unit on D-Day. But the mission had been accomplished. The guns were destroyed, verified by engineers who examined the wrecked artillery pieces in the orchard. The coastal highway was cut and held, preventing German reinforcements from moving between the invasion beaches at the critical moment when the outcome of the entire invasion hung in the balance. The Rangers had held their positions for 2 days against overwhelming odds, demonstrating a level of determination and tactical skill that redefined what military planners thought possible. The strategic impact of the Pointe du Hoc assault extended far beyond the immediate tactical objectives. The destruction of the 6 155mm guns eliminated a battery that could have devastated both Utah and Omaha beaches during the critical hours when troops were most vulnerable. Fire control officers, analyzing the gun positions and fields of fire after the battle, estimated that those 6 guns, if operational and properly directed, could have sunk or damaged dozens of landing craft and killed thousands of soldiers on the beaches. The shells were large enough to penetrate tank armor. The range was sufficient to hit ships offshore. The elevated position provided perfect observation of the entire invasion area. The cutting of the coastal highway prevented German mobile reserves from reinforcing either beach at the moment when such reinforcement might have driven the Allies back into the sea. The 914th Grenadier Regiment, committed to counter-attacking Pointe du Hoc, was unavailable to counterattack at Omaha Beach, where the outcome remained in doubt until late afternoon on June 6. German after-action reports, captured after the war, confirmed that the loss of the coastal highway complicated their response to the invasion and delayed the movement of reserves by critical hours. The Pointe du Hoc assault validated General Eisenhower's faith in specialized forces and innovative tactics over conventional approaches. In his memoirs, published in 1948, Eisenhower wrote of Pointe du Hoc, "The Rangers who scaled those cliffs demonstrated the warrior spirit that would carry us to victory. They proved that courage and initiative could overcome material disadvantage, that training and determination could defeat seemingly superior positions." General Omar Bradley, in his memoir published in 1951, was even more direct about the significance of the assault. "No soldier in my command has ever been wished a more difficult task than that which befell the 34-year-old commander of the Provisional Ranger Force. That Rudder's Rangers were able to accomplish their mission was not merely a tactical success, but a demonstration of the American soldier's capability to execute the impossible when properly led and motivated." The Rangers themselves were more modest about their achievement. In oral histories recorded decades later, survivors consistently emphasized teamwork, training, and luck over individual heroism. First Sergeant Lamel, who received the Distinguished Service Cross, the British Military Medal, and the French Legion of Honor for his destruction of the guns, always insisted that any ranger could have done what he did. "We were all trained for exactly that mission," he said in a 1999 interview, just 5 years before his death. "Jack Kuhn covered me." Other rangers established the roadblock that allowed us to move inland. The naval gunfire kept the Germans off our backs while we climbed. It was not one man's achievement, but a battalion's achievement, and we lost too many good men for any of us to take pride in individual awards. The physical landscape of Pointe du Hoc remains virtually unchanged today, preserved as a memorial to the Rangers who fought there. The craters from the naval bombardment still pockmark the ground, some over 30 feet in diameter. The shattered bunkers and casemates stand as they were left in June of 1944, concrete walls cracked and scarred by shellfire. The cliff face bears the scars of that June morning, sections of rock broken away where grappling hooks pulled free or where naval shells struck close to the edge. And at the cliff edge, memorials honor both the Rangers who climbed and the men of all nations who fought on D-Day. On June 6, 1984, the 40th anniversary of D-Day, President Ronald Reagan visited Pointe du Hoc. 62 survivors of the 2nd Ranger Battalion who had climbed those cliffs sat in the audience as Reagan delivered one of his most memorable speeches. Standing at the cliff edge, with the English Channel behind him, Reagan spoke directly to the aging Rangers. "These are the boys of Pointe du Hoc. These are the men who took the cliffs. These are the champions who helped free a continent. These are the heroes who helped end a war." The strategic lessons of Pointe du Hoc extended far beyond June of 1944. The assault validated the concept of specialized training for specific missions, proving that properly prepared forces could accomplish objectives that conventional forces could not. The United States Army Ranger concept became a permanent part of American military structure. Today's 75th Ranger Regiment traces its lineage directly to the 2nd Ranger Battalion and considers Pointe du Hoc a defining moment in Ranger history. Every Ranger who graduates from training visits Normandy, stands at the cliff edge, and looks down at the beach below, understanding in a visceral way what their predecessors accomplished. The tactical innovations developed for Pointe du Hoc influenced military doctrine for decades. The use of specialized equipment, the emphasis on speed in assault, the concept of climbing teams with different weapons loads, the importance of suppressive fire during vulnerable phases of an assault, all of these became standard elements of special operations doctrine. Modern military cliff assault techniques still reflect lessons learned at Pointe du Hoc, but perhaps the most enduring lesson of Pointe du Hoc was not tactical or technological, but human. The assault demonstrated that properly motivated soldiers, given clear objectives and adequate training, could overcome obstacles that appeared insurmountable. The climb itself had been declared impossible by naval planners and skeptical staff officers. The Germans themselves believed it was impossible, and that belief became their fatal weakness. They could not conceive that anyone would attempt what the Rangers attempted, so they were not fully prepared when the impossible became reality. The 1985 reunion of Pointe du Hoc veterans, held at Fort Hood, Texas, brought together more than 500 former Rangers, many accompanied by their families. These men, now in their 60s, had not seen each other in decades, but the bonds formed on that cliff face proved unbreakable. Colonel James Rudder had died in 1970, having served as president of Texas A&M University and as Texas Land Commissioner after the war. But his widow, Margaret Rudder, attended the reunion and spoke on his behalf. "Jim never talked much about Pointe du Hoc at home," she told the assembled Rangers. "But I know he was proud of what you all accomplished, and he was humbled by the men he lost. He used to say that the real heroes were the ones who didn't come home." First Sergeant Leonard Lamell, then 65 years old, delivered a keynote address that captured the essence of what the Rangers had learned. "We went to Pointe du Hoc, believing we faced an impossible mission. The Germans believed it was impossible too, and that confidence became their weakness. They could not conceive that anyone would attempt what we attempted, so they were not fully prepared for our success. We learned that day that impossible is often just another word for difficult, and difficult is just another word for requiring more courage and more determination than your enemy expects." The statistical record of Pointe du Hoc tells a story that numbers alone cannot fully capture. Of 225 Rangers who landed on June 6th, approximately 135 were killed or wounded during the two-day battle. The casualty rate exceeded 60%. The Rangers held their positions for approximately 48 hours before relief, isolated and surrounded, defending against an enemy force estimated at battalion to regimental strength. The 6 155mm guns were destroyed approximately 3 hours after the initial landing, completing the primary mission objective despite the guns having been relocated. The mission was accomplished by 2 men using thermite grenades, demonstrating that strategic impact does not always correlate with force size. The coastal highway was cut and held. No American or Allied landing craft or ship was hit by fire from Pointe du Hoc's guns on June 6th, validating the mission's strategic necessity. The human cost extended beyond the battle itself. Many Rangers who survived Pointe du Hoc were killed in subsequent operations. The 2nd Ranger Battalion fought through France and into Germany, participating in the Battle of Hurtgen Forest, where casualties were again devastating. Of the 90 Rangers who were still combat effective on June 8th, fewer than 40 survived the war unwounded. The legacy of Pointe du Hoc extends to every modern special operations unit. The 75th Ranger Regiment maintains a memorial to Pointe du Hoc at its headquarters at Fort Benning, Georgia. The Ranger Creed, memorized by every Ranger, includes the line, "I will never leave a fallen comrade to fall into the hands of the enemy." That principle was forged at Pointe du Hoc, where Rangers repeatedly risked their lives to recover wounded comrades under fire, refusing to abandon men even when tactical doctrine would have justified it. For the Germans, Pointe du Hoc represented the beginning of the end. The Atlantic Wall, which had consumed enormous resources and labour, had been breached at what they considered its strongest point. The psychological impact on German defenders throughout Normandy was significant. If the seemingly impregnable cliffs of Pointe du Hoc could be taken, what position was truly secure? The 352nd and 716th Infantry Divisions, which had defended the Normandy sector, were shattered in the days following June 6th. By the end of June, both divisions had ceased to exist as effective fighting forces, their remnants absorbed into other units or simply written off as combat losses. The broader impact on World War II cannot be overstated. D-Day succeeded largely because operations like Pointe du Hoc succeeded. If the Rangers had failed, if those 6 guns had remained operational and had fired into the beaches during the critical hours of June 6th, the outcome at Omaha Beach might have been catastrophically different. The landing at Omaha was already the bloodiest of D-Day, with over 2,000 casualties. Additional artillery, fire from Pointe du Hoc, might have turned a costly success into an outright failure. The commemoration of Pointe du Hoc has evolved over the decades. In 1979, the French government formally transferred Pointe du Hoc to the American Battle Monuments Commission for perpetual care and maintenance. Today, Pointe du Hoc receives more than 400,000 visitors annually, making it one of the most visited D-Day sites. The memorial is simple but powerful, a granite pylon positioned atop a German concrete bunker, with tablets inscribed in French and English. The English inscription reads, "Here on June 6, 1944, elements of the United States 2nd Ranger Battalion, under the command of Lieutenant Colonel James Earl Rudder, scaled the 100-foot cliffs and destroyed the German artillery battery that could have devastated the landings at Omaha and Utah beaches." The assault on Pointe du Hoc stands as one of the supreme examples of military courage and tactical innovation in the Second World War. The mission succeeded because it was executed by men who refused to accept failure, who had trained for months for this exact scenario, who understood that the mission was larger than their individual survival. The Germans were correct in their assessment that the cliffs were nearly impregnable from the sea, but they failed to account for the training, determination, and tactical skill of the Rangers who climbed them. The Rangers were correct in their confidence that they could accomplish their mission, though the cost was higher than anyone had hoped. The 6 guns were destroyed, the coastal highway was cut, the invasion succeeded, but that success was purchased with the blood of 135 men killed or wounded, a price that the survivors never forgot and that continues to resonate through the decades. The transformation of impossible to difficult to accomplished is the essential story of Pointe du Hoc. It began with a German defensive position that appeared unassailable, protected by natural barriers that military theory said could not be overcome. It continued with American planners who refused to accept that unassailable meant impossible, who identified a force capable of attempting the seemingly impossible and gave them the resources and time to prepare. It climaxed with 225 Rangers who climbed 100 feet of sheer rock under fire because they had been trained to do exactly that and because their mission demanded it. The Rangers who survived went on to varied lives after the war. Some remained in the military, carrying the lessons of Pointe du Hoc into subsequent conflicts. Others returned to civilian life, becoming teachers, businessmen, laborers, continuing the lives that had been interrupted by war. But they never forgot their fallen comrades. As the decades passed and the numbers of survivors dwindled, those who remained felt an increasing responsibility to ensure that the story of Pointe du Hoc was not forgotten, that the sacrifice of those who died on the cliffs and in the fields beyond was remembered and honored. The final chapter of the Pointe du Hoc story is being written now, as the last survivors pass away and the living memory of that June morning fades into history. But the cliffs remain, and the memorial stands, and the story endures of 225 men who proved that with training, courage, and determination, there is no position that cannot be taken, no cliff that cannot be climbed, no objective that cannot be achieved when the mission demands it, and when men are willing to pay the price that success requires. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.